Okay, so first let me apologize for having to miss class last night. Telling you, my stomach's feeling better. But that's what happens when you become a classroom teacher is you get all their germs. So thank you for being flexible and responding to those questions that I emailed you. And so I'm going to go through in this the lecture that I would have given last night. If you hear a little low hum in the background, I'm actually working in my office at school that has no AC, so that's just the fan. I would turn it off, but I would dehydrate and die. All right, so we would have talked last night about creating a positive classroom environment. So I think this tri diagram here gives you a good indication of what that looks like in the major components. So where our classroom culture, our classroom setup in its environment, and then our role as the teacher, where those three things combined, that's where we begin to see a positive classroom environment. So we're going to talk about structuring your actual physical environment, structuring the emotional environment of your classroom, and then what your role is as the teacher to promote that self-esteem for students. So Konza, Granger, and Bradshaw in 2001, they have a book called Classroom Management, a Survival Guide. It's a really interesting book if you're looking at classroom management procedures, and it's going to tell you about the physical environment in one chapter about your classroom setup explains a lot about who you are and your expectations as a teacher. So I asked you to email me some question response, and so far those are pretty interesting about like what types of classes you remember in high school and how they were set up. So we're going to talk about structuring the physical environment in terms of your desks, where do students sit, your decorations, and music that you might play in your classroom. So first, in talking about desk arrangement, so typically when we have desks in groups facing each other, like in this bottom right photo, the idea is that we're trying to simulate classroom discussion or to promote group work in some sort of aspect. Now, I know teachers who leave their desks in groups like this the entire school year. My concern with that is you're promoting or you're not promoting individual thought or thinking in that aspect. You're always allowing students to be clustered. So if they're doing something where you want independent thinking or independent work, they may feel tempted to you look at their neighbor's work or talk to their neighbor or something like that, which is natural. And if that's the way your classroom's always set up, then that's going to be like students' expectations throughout the year is that like this is an okay thing. So I think it's great to have students in collaborative spaces like this, but I also think that you shouldn't leave it in this situation all year round either. Divvying it up is really important. So when you have your desk in a single or double row, this is a good example of like independent work. So think about like if you're doing a standardized test. For instance, I have to give the PSAT tomorrow here at school, and this is how my desk need to look. So when they're in single rows, that's going to demonstrate like you need to do this on your own. This is independent thought, independent work. So maybe you divvy it up for tests or for writing assignments, something like that. Independent reading. Those would all be good times to perhaps have your desks in those single rows. Desks in a U shape, I try to do this in my classroom a lot just because I have some flexibility since I don't have standard desks. I have like mini tables with detachable chairs. So when you can put your desk in a U shape, like in this photo, what you're looking at is allowing each student to feel like they have a voice or a space in the classroom because you can individually connect with each student. Now, obviously space is going to be a limitation for you to get it in a setup like this. But if you can in some form or fashion, I think this is a good way to facilitate classroom discussions. I think it's really important that you connect with each student and who's ever speaking, presenting, or leading the discussion is in that middle of the U space. Having your desks in workstations really helps develop management of skills. So think back to like elementary classrooms where you have like centers, and that's not just for elementary; it could be middle or even high school. I've seen centers happen, but in this situation, you can see that like um, it's similar to the group dynamic when we have them in clusters, but in this we have like specific tasks. So there's a lot of different U shapes, that kind of thing. Think about in a science class when they have lab stations. This is kind of the same idea: is that we're a cluster, group of people coming together to do some sort of task in this space.
Remember that all your seating arrangements really need to accommodate some sort of inclusive environment. That's why I recommend that U shape when you can. Foreman in 96 notes that some classrooms are going to require a free and quiet space to facilitate that learning. So how can you arrange a room where you have some sort of designated like space where students could sit quietly and work? In my classroom, I'll keep my doors open, so I have two entrances and exits in my classroom because I have a kind of an interesting setup in a big room. But there's some space right outside in the hallway too that my students get to use if they need some quiet space, and I can just monitor inside and outside the room. Like it's an easy flow process. But think about where you can put students in your space that might allow them that free, quiet, alone period to get something done. So think about where you're going to place your students. Now, some students are going to have 504 accommodations that allow them preferential seating or that require them to sit near the teacher. Make sure you look at those with your classes to understand who needs to sit where. But what you want to try to figure out is where can you see students who might be easily distracted. And so you want to think about away from doorways or windows, those high traffic areas. Preferably you want to place them on one side of the room that's close to the front. So if you keep them to one side of the room, that's going to help like with some of those distraction in the major traffic flow areas. So this doesn't mean put them in the back of the room like secluded. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying at the front of the room to either the left or the right side, depending on where less traffic flow happens. An inclusive classroom should place students in the area of the class that are best suited to their needs. So where can students sit that are going to allow them the best opportunity? Spoiler alert, you're not going to know that in the beginning. So you may have to create a seating chart well into the first few weeks of school where you move students around based on what you've observed those first few weeks of school. That's a good teaching practice. Don't just be dead set in where students sit, and don't be just dead set on allowing them to sit wherever they want because you're going to have to make some modifications, I guarantee you. So this is really important to me. So classroom decoration. Students first like to see their work displayed, even at the high school level. So I worked with this teacher a few years ago. She's just brilliant. She's an English teacher. And when I walked into her classroom to first meet her, like that first day of school, her classroom was totally empty. There was literally nothing on the walls. And I was like, whoa, hey, Kathy, what is going on in here? She was like, oh, there'll be stuff up. It's just going to be everything that the kids make and do. And I was like, oh, that's such an interesting concept. So I went back in like 2 weeks later, and students writing and drawings and homework and all these different things that they created in that space made up the decorations of the classroom, and it just looked brilliant. She was intentionally planning on how to do it, and it was really gave them a sense of belonging in that space. It was just a great use of space. I, on the other hand, because I have less things that they actually like physically do because it's a speech class, I decorate my room. So if this is not your strength, tag somebody in to help. So my wife always comes and helps me. If you have a brother or a sister or a mom or a dad or a significant other, someone who is good at that type of thing, let them come in and help you. When I worked my first year teaching, we were blessed that we had an interior design class. And the teacher in that interior design class, Ashley Dodson, just was incredible at her job. And she had her students come into my classroom space and really help me set it up and give it that creative spark that it needed. Because I'll tell you this, when your classroom doesn't have anything up on the walls, it just feels prison-like. It feels like there's no ownership of the space, there's no life being breathed into the space. So make sure you allow students to create. The very last slide on here, oh, I'm sorry, it's not in there yet. I'm going to send you guys a picture of my classroom. Here's one example of some student work that my students have done that I put up on the walls. So I had them in the first weeks of school do what I call the My Life CD, where they choose 10 tracks. You can see there at the bottom. 10 tracks that really make up or represent their life, things that they feel connected with, things that they listen to when they're in a slump, that kind of thing. So some of my favorites down there, right? Look at number 6, Young, Dumb, and Broke. If you've never heard that song, it's about being a high school kid. It's interesting. And then on the front, they designed like an album cover for it. So I can see from this student Yet music's a big factor, and it looks like to me, because of those headphones and all the noise outside of her, that she's representing that music allows her to kind of drown out the noise of the day or different people's thoughts and opinions, which I thought was really interesting. Speaking of music, music can be a great addition to a classroom, right? You can use it as a reward, you can use it to create a positive mood, you can help broaden students' musical experiences and things they listen to. In an inclusive environment, music can comfort and calm. It can help focus students. Research definitely shows that classical music in the background can help boost like cognitive thinking and cognitive recognition. Also, it can be a good way for you to connect with your students. So when I was working at John Horn High School in inner city Mesquite, it's a more urban district. Whites were definitely the minority in that school when I was there. And this shows you how long ago this was, if you know anything about Lil Wayne. So the Carter 4 had just come out, which now there's a Carter 5, but it's been years, right? So the Carter 4 just came out. So I went to, back when you still bought CDs, to Target and bought the clean version of that album, and I would play it in my classroom when students were working, because at the time the Carter 4 was all the buzz. And it was a great way for me not only to like get students connected and focused in while they were working, because I'm telling you, it was like silent in my classroom when it was playing, but it also gave me something to talk about with them, like, why is this album interesting to you? Which songs do you like? What connects with you? That sort of thing. And it was a great bridge in that kind of cultural divide between their teacher and their everyday life. So I think that's really important if you can make that work. So let's talk about the structure of your emotional environment. So first, I love this quote by Groundwater and Smith and several others in their research from '98. They say it's the teacher's responsibility to value each and every one of the students in their class so that each student feels special and important. And that's our role as educators, is to make each person feel like they're seen, they're heard, and that they're valuable. And that takes effort. You have to intentionally put in the effort to make those students feel connected. So we know that the bond between a teacher and a student is more important with students with management or behavioral issues, such as ADHD or Asperger's or any sort of behavioral issue that may come out in your classroom. So one of the things that I always do in the beginning of the school year is when I have students who seem like maybe behaviorally or socially they might be struggling in my classroom that I'm noticing in the first few weeks, I always make it a point to reach out to their parent and email something super positive about that student. So I might email home to little Jack's parents and say, hey, Jack is such a great student. He's super attentive. He definitely contributes to classroom conversation. I'm really looking forward to having him this year in my class. What that does is it gives that parent an email that they may never have gotten about that student before, something positive. And that goes a heck of a long way. If you come across something negative that happens later in the classroom, you've already broke the barrier with that parent and reached out in a positive way, so you're going to get better feedback on the back end of that. Also, it allows those students, when they get home, for that conversation to come up with their parents. And when you see them again in classroom, I promise you, they're going to be super thankful that you took the time to send that. So students with ADHD sometimes need some extra motivation, right? To maintain attention, reminders to work consistently, to avoid that boredom and those repetitive tasks. So you've got to be intentional about like changing up and divvying up what they're working on, how they're working on it. They can stand up, maybe go for a walk. I have this fourth period class that I've told y'all about that, man, that class is super hyper, right? So once every class period in this 90-minute class period, we just go for a walk. Like we do a lap around our building, we kind of get the jiggles out and the wiggles and the talking, come back and get back to work. It's done a great service to helping them stay on task. Students with Asperger's, somebody once told me, you should have just assumed that all students are somewhere on the spectrum, right? And when somebody told me that, it really put in perspective of like how I approach every student, right? So I think about like, what if there's more going on here than I even know, or that their accommodations or their forms or their testing ever showed me? And if I look in that framework, because everybody has something, right? That's really going to help that bond with that student and help to inspire them to do more in your classroom because they feel connected to you personally. So it's not just with students with Asperger's. You should do that with every student. So let's talk about how they know you and how they get to like you as a teacher, not like in like a friend sort of way, but like a mutual respect type of way. So Glasser in 1993. So Glasser's a super important educational researcher, but he talks about some of these responses, right? So first, who are you? That's kind of a tough question, like for teachers and for students. Who are you? Then he asks, what do you stand for? Then what are you going to ask students to do? What are you not going to ask them to do? What is it that you're going to do for them? And what are you not going to do for them? So if you could like sit prior to getting your first classroom and come back to this slide and write these questions down and figure out how you're going to communicate that to students. And you may just do it straight up like, hey, here are some questions that I wrote down. Here are my responses. Like you could do it that simply to communicate to these students really clear expectations from the beginning and allow them to see who you are and what it is you stand for. If you know anything about Simon Sinek, so Simon Sinek's a motivational speaker and an author, and he has this book called Start With Why. And if you've never seen it, just Google Start With Why. Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K. Sinek does a great job of talking about how people buy why you do something, not what it is that you're doing. So look that up. I think it's really important, and I'll make sure and come back and mention it in class. So how can you do it? Well, you can greet students personally at the door, right? I do this every day. Stand at the door is how I learn names too. Greet people as they come in. Make sure you're making eye contact with them when you're lecturing. Negotiate rules and routines. So like put these expectations out there and allow them to talk about what works and what won't. And kind of come to more of a mutual consensus of what your expectations and rules look like in your classroom. Make sure you're acknowledging those positive behaviors. When you see somebody doing great work, please acknowledge that. And you can do that by just using positive language with your students. And I love this one. Interact with your students outside the classroom. I go to lunch when I can, and I'll eat with some students. I'll talk to them. I go to their extracurricular activities when I can. I just went to the football game last Friday night, and I promise you some of my students are going to come in talking about, hey, Dr. Hamilton, we'd love seeing you. What do you think about the game? That kind of thing. It goes a long way if you're out in that community. Do your best to minimize embarrassment. So you definitely don't want to you don't want to embarrass students outright. Always minimize that. Private conversations goes a long way. Try and use humor where you can. I love to make jokes. I love to laugh at myself. I love to tell silly stories, right? Using bibliotherapy, so like where we can use books to connect with students, right? Let them facilitate that learning. You can use class meetings, right? So we're going to have a meeting as a class to discuss this particular issue, and I want to know what you think and how it's going. And then take-home buddies. So like in lower grade levels, this is like the class pet, but this also facilitates like in a different way when it comes to taking home like peer work, right? Or peer feedback or group work that they then can like keep building outside of the classroom. So here's a definition of self-esteem. There's actually two of them, right? So I actually like the bottom one because it's so simple. A favorable or unfavorable attitude of the self. Rosenberg goes back to 65. It's been around a long time. So self-esteem pop quiz, right? So A, increasing a student's self-esteem will result in increased achievement. Or B, increasing a student's achievement will result in increased self-esteem. So think about that for just a second. I always find this to be actually kind of tricky. So the research actually suggests increased self-esteem doesn't result in increased achievement. Think about that for a minute. So just increasing someone's self-esteem does not facilitate an increase in their actual achievement. So why do you think that is? Well, think about people that you know in your life that have really high self-esteem, but maybe don't have a lot of goals or drive or achievement like resume-wise that we might attribute as achievement, right? So you can really love yourself and be proud of yourself, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to achieve more because there's more to self-esteem than like achievement. So There's two groups in that study that was on the last slide that looked at what causes good and bad grades, right? So group one, things like I can be proud of myself. I can do this. I'm better than most of the other people in this school. I'm satisfied with myself. So these were students that did improve, right? But students who didn't improve were thinking, I'm ashamed of myself. I don't deserve to be in college and I'm worthless. So what it comes down to, hold your head and your self-esteem high. So if we can boost those things in our students, we might not necessarily see achievement results like that data suggests, but we are going to find a different attitude towards pushing and motivating the self. So in group two, they talked about they need to work harder, they can learn this material if they apply themselves, they can control what happens to them in class, and that they have what it takes to do this, which is what I was talking about before. So going back, in group one, these were people that already had self-esteem. Group two, these were people that identified that were like progressing or maybe were not up to the same par as group one with their self-esteem. And these students were looking at like positive inclinations of how they can better achieve achievement, but also in a positive self-esteem way, right? So I have what it takes to do this. I can control what happens to me. That's going to produce actual achievement outcomes rather than just feeling really good about yourself. In that group two, students who didn't improve were again thinking, it's not my fault, right? So deflection of blame. This test was too hard, or the teacher's biased, or I'm just not good at this. So what that really showed us in the data is that taking personal control of your performance actually has increased achievement associated with it. So by the end of that course in those two groups, the average grade for students in that first group was below 50, failing. The average for students in that second group was 62, which is a D minus, which is still poor in some aspects, but it's definitely still passing and better than group one. So we see that when self-esteem is framed in like, I can do more, or that internal reflection of positivity, giving that ownership back to you, the student or the person, that can go a lot further in achieving results. Some other research you can think about. That's really interesting, right? So look at the Koreans scoring ahead of their peers in the US, raising questions about the importance of self-esteem. So let's look at a basic self-esteem breakdown, right? So McGrath says that earned self-esteem develops when we accomplish something worthwhile or when we behave in a personally or socially responsible way. And this is a product of achievement, not the cause, right? Achievement leads to self-esteem. And then global self-esteem is like this general sense of pride in oneself. This doesn't have to be reality-based evaluations, but rather how you feel. It's those internal reflections. It's a general self. So what does this mean for teachers? Don't disregard self-esteem and focus on techniques that are going to increase earned self-esteem. So where I garnered it myself, you just didn't give it to me. And then don't shield students from feeling sad or frustrated and anxious when they lose. Encourage them to like push and evaluate that and feel empowered by what they learned from that opportunity and what they can do better. We can teach resilience, right? So perseverance, and then self-control. How do I respond in this situation? Here's a few more. So pro-social values. So what are positive things like socially that people look for or like in me and in others? So some coping skills. So how do we cope with stress and anxiety? Teaching about courage and what courage looks like and what it takes to act in a courageous way. Managing our feelings. So why do I feel this way? Social skills, so positive interactions with people. Goal achievement, I love SMART goals. SMART stands for golly, you would ask me this on the spot and I can't Google it, right? So SMART goals stand for, I know the M is measurable, the A is attainable, the R is realistic, and the T is timely. So don't quote me on the S right now. But really, is my goal measurable? Can I attain it? Is it realistic, and can I do it in a given amount of time? And then evidence-based self-knowledge. So like, what does the evidence say that I've garnered in my knowledge? Can you show growth to a student? You guys can come back and look at this. This is just another like example in how you can do it. So what I want you to do, and you guys already emailed me this back for the most part, so thank you for that. So how do you plan to arrange your desk, decorate your room? Do you want to use music or not? And what kind of procedures are you going to implement in your own classroom? And again, thank you for being flexible. I hope you got something out of this, and I will definitely revisit some of these key points next week, and I look forward to seeing you in class.